When setting up a supplier within X3, the user will start by clicking on the New button in the upper left-hand corner. From there, the category to the supplier can be set. There's an active flag to indicate as to whether or not this is a current supplier that one does business with. A supplier identification number can be set. Down on the Identity tab, the short title and acronym are optional fields. The legal company name and a secondary name to capture the doing business as can be specified. In addition to that, the country, language, federal tax ID, and the default currency that one intends on conducting business with a vendor can be set. Next, on the Address tab, one can specify the remittance and physical addresses. And from there, the mailing address. Once the user specifies the postal code, both the city and state will default in. The website and an additional identifier can be set. One also has the ability to flag this as being the default address associated with the supplier, which in part will populate the default address on the purchase order form. And if you have any additional phone and email addresses that you wish to capture, those can be specified here. Next, on the Commercials tab, one can specify the grade of the vendor if that type of classification scheme is desired. There's a minimum order setting that can be established on the supplier if they specify some minimal order thresholds upon your business. There's an additional flags down here for multi-line orders. If one wishes to issue a purchase order with more than one line item, that flag needs to be set. This acknowledge remittance flag is with respect to if one desires to capture acknowledgments back from the vendor on the PO. Then there's also delivery reminder settings that can be instituted. Down here in the text section, one can establish default purchase order and default return text that can go out on all documents that present or that are associated with the supplier. This text in part is specified up through the top menu bar once the supplier is created. Down here in the print section, there's flags to indicate as to whether or not the supplier requires these respective forms. There's a template code setting in here that can be leveraged for purposes of if the vendor requires special paperwork outside the norm that you provide. In the receipts section, one can specify the holiday calendar, the carrier associated with the supplier, the shipping mode. This location setting can be set in instances whereby if you wish to track off-site inventory. Then there's an additional freight terms setting that can be instituted. The due date basis here is in relationship to the invoices that you receive from the vendor and when the due date clock should start ticking. If one has default elements for freight charges or packaging charges and so forth, these elements in part can be specified here. So if there is a set amount of brokerage fees associated with every order, that could be set. Next, on the Controls tab, you have your normal supplier type. If you have your customer identification number in your vendor's system, that can be captured here. You have a rate type setting that's used in conjunction if you deal with this vendor in foreign denominations outside of US dollars. We have an internal notes section here that will present itself to the user anytime you enter in a purchase order for the supplier. We have credit control features up here whereby we can specify the vendor as being on payment hold, which will withhold all further payments to the vendor. We also in part have dispute settings down here. This hold setting here, which will prohibit any further purchase orders to be entered to the supplier. Down in the statistical groups section, these stack groups can be used for purposes of establishing or leveraging price book information. Then in addition to that, if there's other types of analytical categories that you wish to have associated with the vendor, these 5 stack groups, these are user defined. Next, on the financials tab, in the upper left hand corner, the primary fields of consequence here are going to be the pay to. So if you have multiple suppliers for which you have a common parent entity that you remit payment to, that pay to can be modeled here, along with the risk BP if there was the need to consolidate your exposure with the group of suppliers. This accounting code right here is going to govern the respective accounts payable account that will be charged whenever you enter in an invoice from the vendor. In addition to that, this accounting code is going to govern what the applicable offset is, whether that be to a received not invoiced account or an expense account. This DAS2 settings in relationship to 1099, so all your 1099 vendors should have this DAS2 flag set, which in part will default onto the invoices for that vendor. Your payment terms section down here, if the vendor grants you a settlement discount for retiring payables in an early time frame, that can also be modeled. If you have a set bank account from which your funds should be withdrawn when you pay the vendor, that can be set. And we also have a tax rule setting associated with the vendor. Your analytical section is where your dimensions, your default dimensions for the supplier should be defined if those are at play. Then in addition to that, we have a ranking matrix here on our supplier. If you have certain priorities that you put on lead time and unit price, quality, quantity, and so forth, those can all be found, which will in part populate this Pentagon matrix over here. Your default banking information for the supplier can be expressed on this tab. Over on the Miscellaneous tab, your default buyer and delivery terms, if you're leveraging the import tracking features, can be set. Then we also have a tab in here whereby your suppliers for the, or excuse me, your contacts for the suppliers can be set. And those are everything that's involved in setting up a supplier.